Yes. I think this is mixing up two definitions of what globalism means. There's the globalists, as in people who want global governance, like the UN and the EU, actually promulgating regulations on people they don't govern. I oppose that, right? That's why I was in favor of Brexit. Then there's globalism in terms of free trade. Yes. I'm very much in favor of that because I like cheaper products, and I think that if you make a cheaper product and I make a cheaper product, we should be able to trade with each other, and it's none of your damn business to take away my ability to buy a product or produce a product to be sold in another nation, right? Because I'm for freedom. I'm not in favor of government intervention. As far as who's responsible, like who takes care of these people, the truth is that the economy, I mean, this is an unpopular answer, but the market takes care of these people because the reality is that the percentage of unemployment in 1900, right, when people weren't even making cars, right? They were still doing what happened to all the horse and buggy manufacturers? Right? All of them ended up finding other jobs. This is what happens in a developing economy. And the economy is constantly developing. So that doesn't mean that it's going to be easy for people who are thrown out of work. It isn't. And this has been true since the days of the Industrial Revolution. Right? There was a whole group in Britain called the Luddites, and they would go around literally smashing machinery, right? Because the Industrial Revolution created these machines, they were all out of work, they couldn't do the work by hand. They would literally go around blowing up machines to the extent the British government made it a death penalty offense to blow up machinery, because it was becoming so prevalent. Well, the British economy didn't collapse. The British economy continued to grow, right? The Industrial Revolution drove the British Empire to new heights. The reality is that technological change is good for people because it means that we don't have rotary telephones anymore. We have the iPhone, and we have people who work on the iPhone both here and overseas, and we work on different products. Somebody tweeted at me the other day, you know, back in the 1950s, 90% of T-shirts were made in the United States. It's like, yes, so now they're all made in Vietnam, and we make iPhones over here. It's better. Right? The purpose of the economy is not to create jobs. It's to create better products that we all have the power to consume. And in a country where even the poorest people have an iPhone, it's very difficult to argue that technological development and free trade have really been a net loss for the American population. That doesn't help the guy who loses his job. It doesn't help the guy who loses his job. But unfortunately, it's your responsibility as an individual human being to cultivate skill sets that allow you to make that labor transferable. And all of these, and you can have government actors lie to you. I mean, everybody just wants somebody to lie to them in the end. When the government says we have a make work program or we have a government training program, none of these have been proved at any point to actually create jobs or help people transition into new jobs. Because as we all know, anybody who's ever worked a job, where did you learn to do your job? Working at the job, right? You didn't go to a program. When I was a lawyer for 5 minutes, right? I didn't learn how to be a lawyer by going to law school. I learned how to be a lawyer by actually being at a law firm. And this is true for the vast majority of people. So anybody who lies to you and tells you that he's going to bring jobs back by shutting down free trade with China or such nonsense, he will bring a few jobs back, right, so to speak, because he'll penalize all the rest of us by making us pay higher prices. But he's not going to bring jobs total back. He'll kill the economy. So it's hard to say to people, your life is in your hands, but that's what freedom is called. Your life is in your hands, and it's not my responsibility to take care of you. It's your responsibility to take care of you. It's your responsibility to take care of your kids. And I'll give you a helping hand if you come to me and you show me that you're willing to work. But that's my decision. That's not your decision to distribute my property.
Because our hierarchical organizations make and do things that people want, and because people differ in their competence in doing so, different people experience different demand for their services. We adjudicate such demand with pay. This is the alternative to slavery. If you are producing things that people want, then you are entitled to charge what people are willing to pay for your services, or to refuse to provide such services at your whim if you choose. You get this privilege because what you provide for other people has value, and it is therefore useful for other people to encourage you to continue to provide it. They don't have to buy what you're offering either, any more than you have to produce it. Although that's not the very definition of freedom, it certainly constitutes an important element of freedom. Because some people are more competent at making or doing those things, they can demand a higher price for their participation. This is because of what they're offering, not because of what they intrinsically deserve. Let's say it again. It isn't what you deserve for intrinsic reasons that determines your outcome. It's the worth that others attribute to your offerings. Think of an offering on eBay. No seller says, I am Azerbaijan, and my mother has Alzheimer's, and I'm not well educated, but I'm tall and strong, although not very attractive, and I was bullied as a child, but I'm quite musical, although I only have one friend, and I'm slightly overweight and prone to anxiety, so you have to pay me $50 for my second-hand crock pot. They say, instead, I have this item, and you don't care who I am, and I don't care who you are, except that I will describe it honestly and ship it, and you will pay for it if we can agree on a mutually beneficial price. That's trade. The reward runs both ways. Trade is not charity. Trade is mutually beneficial. Trade does not and cannot rectify historical or biological injustices. It can only partly and momentarily satisfy the people engaged in the particular trade, because the problem of distribution is so complex that it has to be outsourced to the collective intelligence. No person, group of persons, or imaginable computational device can perform the calculations of price. The measurements can't even be made. This is because the price of anything is dependent on the price of everything else. And to make it worse, is always shifting. Flawed as the free market system is, we don't have anything better.
Gary, Indiana used to be a very prosperous city like Detroit. And here's a story I tell about Gary. I did it on NPR radio in the US just before I came over. So imagine a guy called Gary who lived in Gary, Indiana. And Gary used to work in the union job in one of the big car plants. And it's 1991, he was earning $30 an hour. That's really what he was earning in 2016 dollars, so it was a lot. And they shut it down, and they moved it abroad. And bits went to Mexico, and some other bits went elsewhere, and all that sort of stuff. So he was meant to retrain. He was meant to retrain as a software engineer, but there was no money for retraining because we gave it all away in tax cuts, because that's what politicians like to do. So he then got a job in a call center. He was fine, he adapted, but he's down to $15 an hour. 5 years later, the call center goes from Indiana to India. He now works for the largest employer in the United States, which is Walmart. He gets $11 an hour. And every day he reads in the newspaper that him and all his mates are about to be replaced by robots. Wall Street's delighted. They got bailed out. He lives in a slum. He's pissed. That's Trump's support. That's an incredibly powerful self-understanding and self-narrative. Now tell me what Clinton's narrative is. There isn't one. There isn't one. That's why Trump cannot be discounted. All of the gaffes, all of the racism, all the incendiary comments, it's not just feeding to the base. It's bouncing off him for a reason, because he deep down has one really powerful narrative and a really connected core constituency. And that type of thing hasn't happened in American politics in a generation. Second problem, Branko Milanovic's not-so-happy globalization story. So along the bottom here, you've got the entire global income distribution from 0 to 100. The poorest person in the world to the richest person in the world. And what you've got on the y-axis there is the amount of income growth you've had over 30 years. Tells a really interesting story. Countries like Chad are poor and will stay poor. But once you get past Chad, there's been very rapid income growth. And the best example of this, as Australia knows all too well, are the people that have been buying all your dirt for the past 25 years, namely China. So to go from a country where you had 400 million people below the World Bank's $2 a day poverty level to an average income of $6,600 per capita, that's incredible. We've never seen anything like that in human history. So for some people, this has been utterly brilliant. It really has been the best of times. But notice where that graph begins to go down. It starts to do that at the 67th percentile. Guess who that is? That's the poorest person in the United States.
So this is a book that's going to happen at some point. So this is how it goes. At the end of World War II, after the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, and a global catastrophe, one of the things that political elites learned in the West was you have to insulate labor markets. If you subject labor markets to simple price competition, and if you have open financial flows, you will destabilize those labor markets and you will cause a lot of volatility in those markets, which basically means labor gets annoyed. When labor gets annoyed and that coincides with large financial crises, you get into big depressions. And then the politics of that get very nasty. So learning from that, we decided we would insulate labor markets. And we did that in the United States with COLA contracts, cost of living adjustments. We did that in Germany with corporatist institutions. You had big labor on one side, big business on the other. Everything was negotiated. In a sense, it was a labor market cartel. Hold that concept in your head. So that cartel worked really well for a while. And at the same time, product markets were actually quite protected. We had a world in which we had countries that all made similar things and then traded them with each other. Whereas now, under globalization, we have countries that do very, very different things and then trade very differently with each other through much more integrated labor markets and much more integrated financial flows. But before we get there, those product markets and labor markets, which were highly regulated, think the way that America used to do airlines. Right? Think about the fact that you couldn't open a bank account anywhere except in your home country. There were no derivatives. There were no global financial flows. That system produced a ton of inflation, and that's when it blew up in a crisis of inflation in the 1970s. In order to restore the value of capital, we underwent an experiment, which is variously called the Reagan and Thatcher revolutions, neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it. And once you unleash those forces, which are basically things you do, you integrate, you privatize, you liberalize, you marketize, you create a lot of openness in the system. And all of those protections, first in labor markets, either deliberately through policy, beating down on unions, or alternatively much later through things like market integration, which basically says to German workers, you're not really going to have a pay rise for 12 years because globalization for you starts 60 kilometers east of the Elbe. If you don't like it, we'll move the factory to, let's say, Romania.
Outsourcing has nothing to do with economic efficiency. Outsourcing is one of the operations that take place within command economies. The economy is run by a network of command economies called corporations. I mean, what goes on internal to a corporation or a mega corporation is not free trade. It's command economy. A corporation is a totalitarian institution. You know, it has a board of directors at the top, a manager, he gives orders, everyone else follows them down at the bottom. At the very bottom, if you're lucky, you can rent yourself to it and get a job. And if you're sufficiently propagandized, you may even buy some of the junk they produce and so on. But it's certainly not, it has nothing to do with what any classical economist would have called a free market. Outsourcing is just part of the technique. Outsourcing is internal to the corporation, right? The corporation picks some supplier to outsource to and keeps them under control, because then they can get much cheaper labor, hideous working conditions, don't have to worry about environmental controls. They get inputs to themselves, which are very cheap. That increase, for those of you who've studied economics, you know that increases productivity. If you get artificially cheap inputs, that increases productivity, because productivity is measured in terms of, value produced divided by the number of workers. So you get nice measures of productivity, which have nothing to do with productivity. They just have to do with the fact that you've got 20-year-old women off the farms in China locked into factories and working until they die in a couple of years. That is very healthy for the economy. But it's all internal to big command economies. That's one of the reasons why the concept trade is so ridiculous. I mean, what's called trade would certainly not have been called trade by Adam Smith. Outsourcing happens to send goods across the border into the United States, but it's under the control of a command economy.
I rise in support of the rule and in support of H.J. Res. 373, the Solomon Resolution, to disapprove the extension of MFN status for China. I do not often agree with my Republican friend from upstate New York, but he's right on this issue, and I'm happy to work with him on it. Mr. Speaker, this is an issue of human rights and foreign policy, and it is important to us for that reason. but it is also an issue dealing with the loss of American jobs and the lowering of our standard of living, and for that reason, it should also be of concern to every member of Congress. Mr. Speaker, multinational corporations and the big business community have launched a huge lobbying effort to preserve MFN status for China, claiming that their investments create American jobs. Unfortunately, they are wrong, very wrong. While it is true that the huge multinationals like Chrysler, AT&T, and Boeing and others can in fact make huge profits by investing in China, it is not true that those investments improve the standard of living of the average American worker. In fact, the opposite is the case. Mr. Speaker, when multinational corporations throw American workers out on the street and move to China, where workers are paid 15 cents an hour, where slave labor exists, where basic democratic rights are ignored, where workers cannot organize free trade unions, that scenario may be good for the profit margins of the large corporations, but it is a disaster for American workers. It is absurd to be talking about most favored nation status for a country which allows for the ruthless exploitation of its workers. American workers cannot and must not be asked to compete against the workers in China, who in many instances are working under subhuman conditions. I know that this is a very radical idea, but maybe, just maybe, we might want to encourage American corporations to reinvest in this country for decent jobs and decent wages for our workers, rather than in China, where they pay workers $2 or $3 for a day's work. We are told by the Commerce Department that the $9 billion a year in exports from the U.S. to China generates 225,000 American jobs. But if this is correct, then what is the effect of the over $30 billion a year in imports from China, over 3 times the level of exports? Strangely enough, the Commerce Department hasn't been able to calculate that figure. And I think the reason is clear. It would show that our massive $24 billion trade deficit with China is costing hundreds of thousands of Americans their jobs. When Chinese students and workers were violently suppressed in Tiananmen Square, Americans and people all over the world were horrified.
Chair recognizes the gentleman. Gentleman's time has the gentleman is recognized for 30 additional seconds.
Politicians vowed to act swiftly and strongly to preserve China, pressure China to stop its repression. But although the repression goes on, American corporations have decided to put profits ahead of human rights. In fact, between 1988 and 1992, U.S. corporations increased their investments 4-fold. Mr. Speaker, let us support the Solomon resolution. Let us tell China that they cannot continue their types of policies. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired.